The Political Party Funding Act comes into effect today. The legislation seeks to promote transparency in the South African political space and to ensure equitable distribution of funding to parties in the National Assembly. Now, the Act has been welcomed by smaller parties who say it will level the playing fields. But how will this law impact on the upcoming local government elections? We're joined by a panel of experts this morning. Dr. Sithembile Mbete is Senior Lecturer of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria. We're also joined by the Chief Whip of the Inkatha Freedom Party, that's Narend Singh. Good morning to both of you. Thank you so much for your time this morning on the AM report. Narend, I want to begin with you because, you know, it was My Vote Counts that successfully asked the court to mandate the disclosure of political party funding, but the IFP was also involved in drafting that legislation.
Yes, good morning to Michelle and good morning to viewers and good morning to Dr. Mbete. Well, the IFP, represented by me, was part of drafting that legislation. And I must say, Michelle, that we started that drafting process even before the court had ruled on the My Vote Count matter. I think we always felt that there was need for transparency in terms of political party funding, where it came from, who gave monies to whichever political party. And yes, we've got the act and it's implemented from today, the 1st of April.
So the IFP has said that, you know, the bill will have a big impact for smaller parties and, in fact, will help smaller parties. How so?
Well, not really a big impact. I think relatively it will have a positive impact on us because in the past act and the way they distributed funds, the funds were made available by the fiscus to the IEC to distribute to political parties. And the distribution was based on a proportional and an equitable representation basis. Now, 10% of the funds that were made available were top sliced and equally distributed amongst the parties in the National Assembly, and the other 90% were distributed on a proportional basis. So which means that the larger party had a biggest proportion of that fund. But during our negotiations on this bill, we as a smaller parties argued that we didn't think it was fair that there should only be 10% top slice. And we successfully negotiated that 1/3 of those funds should be top sliced and distributed to all the parties equally, and the other 2/3 should be distributed on a proportional basis. So to that end, the smaller parties will get a little more than we had received because now 1/3 of that total fund is going to be distributed equally.
Dr. Mbete, is this something that you think is long overdue in our political space?
Certainly it is. Before the My Vote Counts case that was heard and that ultimately led to this process beginning in 2003, IDASA, which was another think tank and organization, had taken the issue of party funding to the Western Cape High Court. And in that case, the court ruled that political parties are private entities and any process for making political parties disclose their donors needs to be done and facilitated through Parliament. And so this is a process this is an event that's a long time coming, nearly 20 years. And I think it is long overdue. And certainly it's going to take a while to implement the Act fully. But the most important part of the Act that will be implemented in this year for the local government elections is around transparency of funding. So all political parties are going to have to disclose who their funders are. And I think that alone is going to make a big difference.
Just explain it to us, you know, for the sake of our viewers, the principle of transparency only applies for donations over 100,000 Rand, which must be declared by both donors and recipients, and also the issue around no funding by foreign governments or people overseas. That is no longer allowed, will no longer be allowed under the Political Party Funding Act. But that 100,000 Rand cap, what does that tell you about perhaps the ways that might be found around that?
So there is potential, of course, that a particular donor may try to donate like lots of small amounts under the 100,000 Rand limit. But of course, by having both parties and the donors required to declare, It means that if a donor is donating 12 sets of 20,000 rand, for example, they will have to declare that they have donated 240,000 rand in 2.4 million rand in total, in order to, or 240,000 in total, in order for in order to meet the legal requirements. So the idea is that it should be incredibly difficult for parties to get around this issue of the 100,000 rand limit. I think that having the 100,000 rand limit is intended because there is a lot of money that parties will get from their members, 20,000 will be bequested or whatever. And so to reduce the burden of reporting on both the parties and the IEC, I think that having that threshold has been very important. But I think that there are other ways in the Act that are aimed at preventing people trying to circumvent the legislation.
Yeah, Narend Singh has spoken to us about, some of the benefits, particularly for smaller parties. One is the current allocation to political parties of that 150 million rand in the National Assembly. But what about the bigger parties? Which bigger parties do you reckon might be the most, shall we say, disenfranchised by this Act?
Well, Michelle, yeah, thanks. If you look at the Act as it would apply now, one would straight away say that the ANC and the DA might be disenfranchised to some extent, and perhaps the EFF to some extent, because the equitable portion would be reduced. But just picking up on the point of Dr. Mbete, the cumulative amount must not exceed 100,000. And, we have been going through workshops with the IEC, which is going to be managing this particular process of distribution of funds as they've been in the past. And the regulations are quite onerous. In fact, some of them so onerous that we are querying some of the regulations that they've put in place. But it's a new animal. It's something that we're going to start off with. And for smaller parties, although we'll get a little bit more money in terms of this distribution from government, what is possibly encouraging, and that would depend on how well the IEC markets the Multi-Party Democracy Fund, which has now been established in terms of the Act. And that fund is a fund that would receive money from corporate South Africa and any other donors. So hopefully corporate South Africa will see the need to support multi-party democracy and contribute to that fund. And when that fund has money in it, then the IEC would distribute in terms of the formula that has been agreed to.
Yeah. Dr. Mbete, I mean, if we think back to some of the corruption cases that have been in the country's courts, organizations that have, and companies that have contributed large amounts of monies to political parties and who, it would appear, in return have received tenders in the billions of rand. That takes us to the root of why this Act is so important.
Certainly it does. And one of the biggest things that is important about this Act, at least in the short term, is just transparency for us to know who is funding different political parties. Because, of course, one of the problems that we've had that's allowed for this kind of tender corruption to take place is that we don't know who has donated 1.2 million or 3 million to an individual in a party or to the party as a whole, that then leads to those kinds of procurement decisions being made. Of course, the other thing that is important about this funding Act is that through the creation of the multi-party fund, is that it allows for corporations that, for example, are worried that there may be political risk involved in funding one particular party, to put money into the Multi-Party Funding Act, which then allows that in multi-party fund, which then allows for that money to be distributed according to the formula to a wide range of political parties that are represented, and so it mitigates the political risk different corporations may be facing. Of course, there's also possibility of foreign governments funding through the multi-party fund. So they can put money into the fund, and then that fund will distribute the money, but they can't donate directly to a political party. But I certainly think that the transparency requirements on both sides of both the party and the donor, and then the different limits and the regulations, as Mr. Singh has pointed out, I think are important in trying to reduce the opportunity for the kind of procurement corruption that we have seen.
Yeah. Narend, I want to just end off with you, because you've mentioned that the regulations are quite onerous in the lead up to the local government elections. What are some of those onerous regulations that you reckon the IEC might perhaps struggle to regulate and implement?
Well, I think what Dr. Mbete said, Michelle, about, some of the parties receiving 12 times 20,000, 240,000. There are always ways of circumventing what is contained in the Act. But as far as small political parties are concerned, we realize that money is the milk of politics. And, the larger the party, they've always had access to funds, and patronage, as Dr. Mbete has said, has been one of the ways that they've received funds. I mean, the Zondo Commission is a classic example of the kinds of funds that political parties have been receiving. We, as the smaller parties, rely on membership and a little odd 10,000 and a 5,000 here from loyal members of the party. Corporates have been, I must say, contributing to multi-party democracy, but they have been contributing directly to us. Now they'll have to put it into the fund. But moving forward, I think the smaller parties are always disadvantaged when it comes to competing on the election landscape. And perhaps government needs to think of increasing the amount that's allocated to the IEC for distribution. That will allow political parties not to do underhand things like some of them are involved in. And that will also assure the taxpayer that political parties are getting sufficient funds to be able to manage an election campaign. Because it's pretty expensive to manage any election campaign, particularly in our country, with the way we have to do it, with posters and rallies and different methods than other first world countries adopt when they're conducting elections.
Yeah, absolutely. And these are all important factors in upholding a multi-party democracy such as ours. To both of our guests, thank you so much for your time this morning on the AM Report. The Political Party Funding Act comes into effect today. Our guests, Dr. Sithembile Mbete from the University of Pretoria in the Department of Political Science, and of course the IFP's Chief Whip, Narend Singh, joining us on that issue.